He was called El Libertador, the Liberator, a man who freed an entire continent, who defied an empire, who changed the course of history forever. From the mountains of Venezuela to the battlefields of Colombia, Ecuador, Peru, and Bolivia, Simón Bolívar led the revolution that shattered Spanish rule in South America. But his war was not just against an empire. It was a battle against betrayal, political chaos, and his own impossible dream of uniting an entire continent. At the height of his power, Bolívar ruled over millions, commanding armies that defeated the mighty Spanish forces. But in the end, his dream of unity would collapse, and he would die not as a hero, but as a man abandoned by the very nations he had freed. So who was Simón Bolívar? A visionary? A dictator? A hero? Or a man who dreamed too big? Before Simón Bolívar became the liberator, before he led armies and overthrew Spanish rule, he was just a child born into a world controlled by an empire. The year was 1783. Bolívar was born into one of the wealthiest aristocratic families in Caracas, Venezuela. His family owned plantations, mines, and vast estates. They lived in luxury, but despite their wealth, they were not truly free. Because in the Spanish colonial system, power belonged only to those born in Spain. The Spanish crown ruled over its colonies with absolute authority. The highest positions in government, the military, and the church were all controlled by Spaniards from Europe, not the people born in the Americas. This created a deep divide between the ruling elite and the Creoles people like Bolívar, who were wealthy, educated, but treated as second-class citizens in their own land. From an early age, Bolívar was surrounded by the ideas of rebellion and freedom. He lost both of his parents when he was a child, but his education continued under mentors who would shape his destiny. One of them, Simón Rodriguez, introduced him to the writings of the Enlightenment Rousseau, Montesquieu, and Voltaire ideas that spoke of liberty, democracy, and the right to self-rule. At just 16 years old, Bolívar was sent to Spain to complete his education. There, he witnessed the heart of the empire that controlled his homeland. He studied the ways of European nobility, but he also saw their corruption, their arrogance, and their belief that the colonies existed only to serve them. While in Europe, he also witnessed a revolution. In France, Napoleon Bonaparte had seized power, overthrowing the old monarchy and redefining what leadership meant. Bolívar saw how a single man could change history, how an idea could inspire armies, and how a people could rise up against tyranny. Then, in 1805, standing atop Monte Sacro in Rome, Bolívar made a vow that would define the rest of his life. He swore that he would not rest until he had freed his homeland from Spanish rule. It was an oath that would lead him into battle, into exile, and into the pages of history. But Bolívar was not the only one ready for change. Across Latin America, a storm was building. The people were growing restless. Revolutions had already shaken North America and France. The Spanish Empire, once powerful, was beginning to crumble under its own weight. And soon, the first shots of independence would be fired. By the early 1800s, Spain's grip on Latin America was weakening. The once mighty empire was stretched thin, burdened by wars in Europe, and struggling to maintain control over its distant colonies. Across South America, revolutionary movements were beginning to rise, and Bolívar saw his opportunity. In 1810, the first major step toward independence began. The people of Caracas, Venezuela, inspired by revolutionary ideals, declared their loyalty to the King of Spain, and only if he granted them more autonomy. It was not yet a declaration of full independence, but it was a challenge to Spanish authority. But Spain had no interest in negotiation. Instead of granting more freedom, the Spanish crown cracked down harder, sending in forces to crush the growing movement. The time for talk was over. Bolívar and his allies had to choose: submit to Spanish rule or fight for their freedom. Bolívar chose war. The first phase of the Venezuelan War of Independence had begun. Bolívar joined the revolutionaries, rallying forces and delivering passionate speeches about the need to break free from Spain once and for all. He became a leading figure in the fight, a young officer full of energy and determination, but he was about to face his first great failure. In 1812, a devastating earthquake struck Venezuela, destroying cities and killing thousands. The Spanish authorities used the disaster as a weapon, claiming it was a sign from God that the revolution was cursed. The people, frightened and desperate, began to turn back to Spain for protection. The revolution collapsed. Spanish forces crushed the rebellion and Bolívar was forced to flee the country. It was his first taste of defeat. but it would not be his last. Fleeing to Cartagena, in present-day Colombia, Bolívar wrote the Cartagena Manifesto, a fiery document outlining why the revolution had failed and how it could succeed in the future. He called for a stronger, more organized military campaign, one that would unite all the revolutionary forces across South America instead of fighting as separate factions. He was not giving up. He was planning his return. And in 1813, he did just that. Bolívar led the admirable campaign, a bold offensive that took him back into Venezuela. Town by town, he recaptured lost territory, defeating Spanish forces with speed and surprise attacks. By July 1813, Bolívar marched triumphantly into Caracas. The people welcomed him as a hero, a liberator, and so he took on a title that would follow him for the rest of his life, El Libertador. But Bolívar's fight was far from over. The Spanish were not done. They would return with greater force. And soon Bolívar would face his greatest nightmare, a war unlike any he had ever imagined. Victory had been sweet, but it would not last. The Spanish were regrouping, and they would soon launch a brutal counterattack. The revolution was far from over. Bolívar had liberated Caracas. He had been hailed as El Libertador, the man who would free Venezuela from Spanish rule. But what he did not yet realize was that the war for independence would not be won in a single battle or even a single war. Because the Spanish were not done. As Bolívar celebrated his victory, Spain was preparing a brutal counteroffensive. Across Venezuela, royalist forces loyal to the Spanish crown gathered under the leadership of a ruthless commander, José Tomás Boves. Unlike previous Spanish generals, Boves did not fight with honor or strategy, fought with terror. He recruited escaped slaves, criminals, and peasants, promising them revenge against the wealthy Creole elite, the very people Bolívar represented. This created a civil war within a revolution, Venezuelans fighting against each other, turning independence into a bloodbath. Bolívar's forces, made up of mostly trained soldiers, were unprepared for the sheer brutality of Boves' armies. Boves and his men showed no mercy. They massacred entire towns, slaughtering women and children, burning cities to the ground. They did not take prisoners, only bodies. For Bolívar, this was a nightmare. In 1814, after months of brutal fighting, Caracas fell once again to Spanish forces. Bolívar was forced to flee the city he had just liberated. He watched everything he had fought for collapse. But the worst was yet to come. As Bolívar and his followers retreated from Venezuela, thousands of civilians, men, women, and children who had supported the revolution fled with him. They feared what Boves' men would do to them if they stayed behind. Bolívar led them south, trying to escape to safety. But there was no escape. The Spanish forces caught up to them near the town of Cumaná, and there, one of the darkest moments of the war occurred. As Spanish troops surrounded them, Bolívar ordered a desperate escape by boat, but there were too many people and not enough vessels. Thousands of unarmed civilians were left behind on the shore. The Spanish forces arrived and slaughtered them all. The beaches were painted red with the blood of Bolívar's supporters. It was a disaster, unlike anything he had ever experienced. He had not just lost a battle, he had lost an entire country. Once again, Bolívar had no choice but to flee into exile. He crossed the Caribbean to Jamaica, where he wrote one of his most famous works, The Letter from Jamaica. In it, he reflected on the failures of the revolution and outlined his vision for a free and united Latin America. He did not just want to defeat Spain, he wanted to create something new, something bigger than any single country. But Bolívar was not ready to give up the fight. Because while he was in exile, a new opportunity was waiting for him, an alliance that would change the course of the war forever. Bolívar had lost everything. His homeland was gone, his revolution crushed, his supporters slaughtered. But his war was far from over. In exile, he would find a new ally, and with them, he would begin the fight that would shake an empire to its core. Simón Bolívar had lost everything. His army was shattered, his homeland was back under Spanish control, and he was once again a man without a country. But Bolívar was not the kind of man who accepted defeat. From exile in Jamaica, he wrote his Letter from Jamaica, a passionate appeal to the world, calling on foreign powers to support the fight for Latin American independence. He described his vision of a united continent, free from Spanish rule, a place where liberty and self-rule would replace colonial oppression. But the world was not ready to help him. Britain ignored his plea. The United States, still recovering from its own revolution, refused to get involved. It seemed that Bolívar's dream was doomed to fail before it even began. Then, something unexpected happened. In Haiti, the first independent Black republic in the Americas, President Alexandre Pétion saw Bolivar's struggle and recognized it as part of a larger fight against oppression. Haiti, which had fought off its own European rulers, understood the power of revolution. Pétion agreed to help Bolivar rebuild his army, but on one condition, that Bolivar promised to free the enslaved people of South America. Bolivar agreed. Armed with Haitian support weapons, money, and ships, Bolivar set sail once again, ready to reclaim the lands he had lost. This time, he had learned from his mistakes. He no longer fought just for the Creole elite, the wealthy class that had initially supported the revolution. Now, he built an army that included the very people Spain had enslaved and oppressed indigenous fighters, black freedmen, runaway slaves, and the fierce Llanero cavalrymen of the plains. This was no longer just a war for independence, it was a revolution for all of South America. In 1817, Bolivar returned to Venezuela and launched a new campaign against the Spanish. The fighting was brutal, but Bolivar had become a master of guerrilla warfare. His army was fast, unpredictable, and relentless. But he knew that to defeat Spain completely, he had to take the war beyond Venezuela. Then came his boldest move yet. In 1819, Bolivar led one of the most daring military campaigns in history, the crossing of the Andes. With an army of just 2,500 men, Bolivar marched through one of the most dangerous mountain ranges on Earth. Freezing temperatures, thin air, and treacherous terrain killed many of his men along the way, but Bolivar pushed forward. And on the 7th of August, 1819, his army descended upon the Spanish forces at the Battle of Boyacá. The Spanish were completely unprepared. Bolivar's forces smashed through their lines, crushing them in a decisive victory. With Boyacá won, Bolivar marched into Bogotá as a hero. New Granada, modern-day Colombia, was free. But this was just the beginning. Bolivar had secured his first major victory, but he would not stop there. He had an empire to destroy and a continent to liberate. The real war was just beginning. Bolivar's victory at Boyacá was more than just a battle won, was the turning point in the war for independence. New Granada was now free, and with it, Bolivar had secured a vital base of operations to continue his fight against Spanish rule. But he knew that as long as Venezuela and Ecuador remained under Spanish control, the war was far from over. He had to keep moving, keep fighting, and keep liberating until every last stronghold of the Spanish Empire was broken. By 1821, Bolivar launched his next major campaign, the liberation of Venezuela. The Spanish still controlled much of the country, and the final battle to secure Venezuela's independence would take place on the 24th of June, 1821, at the Battle of Carabobo. This time, Bolivar commanded a massive force of 6,000 troops. Many of them experienced fighters who had learned the brutal tactics of guerrilla warfare. The Spanish army, though powerful, was stretched thin and exhausted from years of conflict. At Carabobo, Bolivar's army smashed through the Spanish lines, overwhelming them with speed, firepower, and sheer determination. By the end of the day, the Spanish forces had collapsed. With that victory, Venezuela was officially liberated. But Bolivar was not done. Now, he turned his sights southward to Ecuador, Peru, and what would later become Bolivia. In 1822, Bolivar's army marched into Quito, Ecuador, and secured yet another victory against the Spanish. But in Ecuador, he met another revolutionary leader, José de San Martín, the man who had already led Argentina and Chile to independence. San Martín had his own army, his own strategy, and his own vision for South America. The two men met in a secret meeting in Guayaquil, where they discussed the future of the continent. No one knows exactly what was said in that meeting, but when it was over, San Martín stepped away from the fight, leaving Bolivar to take command. With full control of the revolutionary forces, Bolivar now moved to finish the war once and for all. The final stand of the Spanish forces was in Peru, the last major colony still loyal to Spain. This was the heart of Spanish power in South America, and the Spanish army there was strong. But Bolivar had the momentum, the experience, and the vision to see it through to the end. In 1824, he led his troops into battle at Junín, and later that year, his trusted general Antonio José de Sucre delivered the final blow at Ayacuchote battle that sealed Spain's defeat in South America. The war was over. The Spanish Empire in South America had fallen. After 14 years of war, exile, and countless battles, Bolivar had done the impossible, had liberated an entire continent. But the greatest challenge of his life was still ahead. Because now Bolivar had to do something even harder than winning a war. He had to build a new nation from the ashes of the old. Bolivar had won the war, but winning peace would prove even more difficult. The dream of a united Latin America was within his grasp, but soon it would begin to slip away. Simón Bolívar had done what once seemed impossible. He had freed an entire continent. The Spanish Empire in South America was no more. But for Bolívar, the fight was far from over, because winning independence was one thing, keeping it was another. His vision was clear. He didn't want a collection of small, weak nations vulnerable to foreign powers. He dreamed of a united South America, a single, powerful republic stretching from Venezuela to Peru, a nation that could stand alongside the great powers of the world. He called it Grand Colombia Federation, that combined Venezuela, Colombia, Ecuador, and later Peru and Bolivia. For Bolívar, this was the future, but for many of his own allies, it was a dangerous idea. Because while Bolívar saw unity, others saw control. The very people who had fought beside him as generals, his political supporters, the leaders of the new republics, began to turn against him. They didn't want to be ruled by a central government far away in Bogotá. They wanted their own countries, their own governments, their own power. And so, almost as soon as Bolívar created Gran Colombia, it began to fall apart. Civil wars erupted. Regional leaders declared independence from his government. The same men who had fought to remove Spanish rule now fought against Bolívar's rule. But Bolívar refused to give up. Seeing the instability, he made a desperate choice. In 1828, Bolívar declared himself dictator, hoping that by taking full control, he could hold the nation together. But this only made things worse. The very people who had once called him El Libertador now saw him as a tyrant. And then the unthinkable happened: an assassination attempt. One night in Bogotá, a group of conspirators broke into Bolívar's palace, swords drawn, ready to kill him in his sleep. But Bolívar's lover, Manuela Sáenz, saw them coming. She woke Bolívar and urged him to flee. With no time to dress, he jumped from a window and hid in the darkness as the assassins searched for him. He had escaped, but his dream was dying. By 1830, Bolívar was exhausted, physically, politically, and emotionally. He had spent his entire life fighting in Spain, against his enemies, against the divisions tearing his republic apart. And in the end, he lost. Gran Colombia collapsed. The dream of a united South America was over. Seeing that his vision had failed, Bolívar resigned from power, saying, "America is ungovernable. Those who have served the revolution have plowed the sea." It was a heartbreaking admission. He had freed millions, but he could not shape their future. And so the great liberator left politics forever. But Bolívar's story was not over yet, because now he faced his final chapter: exile, isolation, and death. Once Bolívar had ruled over millions. Now he was a man without a country. The very people he had fought for had abandoned him, and in the end, he would die alone. Simón Bolívar had once commanded armies, ruled over nations, and shaped the fate of an entire continent. But in 1830, he was a man with nothing. Gran Colombia, the great republic he had spent years trying to hold together, was gone. The people had turned against him. His allies had abandoned him. His dream of united South America had collapsed into chaos and civil war. And Bolívar himself? He was a political outcast, forced to flee from the very nations he had freed. Heartbroken and sick, he traveled to the Caribbean coast of Colombia, hoping to sail into exile in Europe. But no ship would take him. He was too weak, too ill, and too broken to make the journey. And so he settled in a small town called Santa Marta, where he spent his final months reflecting on his life. The man who had once marched armies over mountains, who had written constitutions, who had defeated an empire, now had nothing but his thoughts. As he lay dying, he watched from a distance as South America fell into division. The countries he had freed were now ruled by men who had once followed him, but who now saw him as irrelevant, a man from another time. Bolívar's last letters were filled with sorrow. "We have achieved independence at the cost of everything else." He had dreamed of a republic of free and equal people, but in the end, South America was just as divided as before. The Spanish had been removed, but new rulers had taken their place. On the 17th of December 1830, Bolívar took his final breath. He was just 47 years old. Once he had ruled over millions. Now he died alone, in a borrowed bed, in a foreign land. Bolívar was gone, but his story was far from over. Because the man who had died forgotten would soon become a legend. Simón Bolívar died believing he had failed. He had dreamed of a united South America, a republic that would rival the great powers of the world. Instead, the continent fell into endless wars, political struggles, and divisions that continue to this day. But Bolívar's name did not disappear. In the years after his death, he became more than just a historical figure, he became a symbol. His legacy grew, reshaped by the very nations that had once rejected him. Statues were built in his honor, cities were named after him. Schools, roads, even entire countries carried his name. Bolivia, the nation he had helped liberate, would forever bear his legacy. But even as he became a hero of history, the question remained, was Bolívar a success or a failure? He had freed South America, but he had not united it. He had won the war, but he had lost the peace. Some see him as a visionary, a man who dreamed of something greater than himself, who fought not for power, but for an ideal, a leader who gave everything for the cause of freedom. Others see him as a flawed ruler, a man who tried to hold too much power, who could not accept that the people he liberated did not want his vision of unity, a general who was brilliant in war but not in politics. But one thing is undeniably changed history. Without Bolívar, South America's fight for independence may have taken decades longer. Without his leadership, his battles, his unbreakable will, the Spanish Empire might have survived in the Americas. Today, Bolívar's face appears on currency, statues, flags, and national symbols. His words are studied, his battles remembered, his legacy debated. He may not have lived to see his dream come true, but in the end, he left behind something far greater. A continent that, despite its struggles, remains free. He was more than just a man. He was El Libertador. Simón Bolívar's story is one of great victories and painful defeats. He was a man who fought against impossible odds, who led armies across mountains, who freed an entire continent from Spanish rule. And yet, in the end, his greatest dream remained unfulfilled. He wanted to unite South America into one powerful republic, but instead, the nations he liberated turned against each other. He envisioned a future of freedom and stability, but what followed was war, division, and political chaos. So, how should history remember him? Was he a visionary who gave everything for his people? Or was he a ruler who could never let go of power? Was he a hero of the revolution? Or was he simply a man who dreamed too big? Let us know in the comments below. And if you found Bolívar's story fascinating, wait until you hear about another revolutionary leader who changed the world, Napoleon Bonaparte, the man who reshaped Europe in his own image.